Welcome nocturnal minds back to our class. Oh, you are really study hard. So, picking up from our last discussion on the interplay between natural and normative orders, we now turn our attention to a phenomenon that was undeniably central to the Greek intellectual landscape: the sheer power and fascination surrounding language itself. We're talking about an era, especially the 5th century BCE, where being able to speak well wasn't just a nice to have, it was practically a superpower. And who were the undisputed champions of this? The Sophists. Their reputation, often controversial, was built squarely on their ability to make students clever at speaking, as Hippocrates puts it in Plato's Protagoras. But let's be clear, when they talk about logos, they're not just talking about winning arguments in the agora or swaying juries. As Kerford pointed out, logos is a rich term encompassing speeches, words, arguments, yes, but also mental processes, even structural principles or natural laws. The Sophists threw themselves into exploring this multifaceted concept from every conceivable angle. So where did this intense sophistic focus on logos lead them? We can see it crystallizing around three main arenas. First, there's the nuts and bolts stuff: grammar and figuring out what counts as the correct name for things, what the text calls orthotes. Think of it as linguistic housekeeping. Second, they turned their critical gaze towards poetry, the traditional bedrock of Greek culture and education. And third, the big one, rhetoric, the art of persuasion, honing argumentative techniques to maximum effect. Now it's important to note, as the text says, that this wasn't some neat, tidy philosophical system laid out in a textbook. It was more like a dynamic exploratory phase. But what they did do was incredibly influential, really kicking off the serious study of language for its own sake, something that would dominate philosophical debates for centuries. And their motivation? It wasn't purely cynical self-interest. Sure, helping clients win cases or students impress audiences was part of it. But there was also a deeper layer: using the analysis of language to provoke critical thinking about the values of their society and to grapple with the complexities of the human condition. This idea of correctness, orthotes, pops up everywhere in their surviving fragments and testimonies, hinting at this dual purpose. This brings us to a fundamental shift in how the Sophists viewed language compared to thinkers before them. Thinkers like Parmenides or Heraclitus saw language, logos, as a window onto an objective reality, a way to grasp an ordered universe. For them, words could point towards truth. But the Sophists flipped the script. They argued that logos isn't a passive mirror reflecting an external world. It's an active tool humans must use to impose meaning onto things. And here's the kicker: they suggested that things themselves don't inherently possess the meaning we assign to them. Language, for the Sophists, becomes the primary instrument through which we construct our understanding of reality. This radical claim that we create meaning through language was absolutely central to the educational package they offered. It wasn't just about using words, it was about understanding how words shape our very perception of existence. Let's zoom in on that first area, correcting words. Protagoras seems to have been a real pioneer here, diving deep into morphology and syntax. Apparently, he was the first to systematically distinguish the genders of nouns: male, female, neuter. Imagine the linguistic detective work. He even proposed changing common terms, like suggesting the feminine nouns Manes wrath and Peleg helmet, familiar from Homer, should actually be masculine. Why? Either because of morphological patterns ending in sigma or c are often masculine, or, quite provocatively, because of their meaning war is an eminently masculine pursuit after all. He also tackled verb modes, linking them to types of speech requests, questions, replies, commands, and again, using this as a springboard to critique Homer for addressing the goddess with a command rather than a prayer. Some sources even mention his interest in verb tenses. He wasn't alone either. Prodicus was famous for his linguistic classifications. Hippias dabbled in rhythms and letter forms. Alcidamas proposed alternative ways to categorize speech types, and figures like Antiphon and Critias were apparently keen on inventing new words, leaving behind quite a few neologisms. Now, how did the Sophists frame this work on words? The concept of correctness of names, orthotes onomaton or orthopeia, pops up frequently. Socrates himself in Plato's Euthydemus basically gives Prodicus the nod as an expert on this very topic. What did Prodicus do? He became renowned for meticulously analyzing synonyms. His method involved grouping similar words together and then painstakingly distinguishing them. Diarrhene. The goal was to pin down exactly what each word referred to in concrete reality. Exactly how he made these distinctions is sometimes murky, Sometimes it seems based on established usage, other times perhaps radical etymological reasoning. But his approach implies a belief in a one-to-one link between words and things, meaning that synonyms are just illusions of similarity. Notice the shift in focus here compared to Socrates, who often asked, "What is X?" Prodicus seems more concerned with, "How does X differ from Y?" It's a subtle but significant change in perspective. So why all this fuss about distinguishing words? Was it just academic navel-gazing? Not entirely. While these linguistic distinctions certainly had value in grammatical analysis, their role in training pupils was paramount. The ultimate aim was practical: to teach students how to wield language effectively, to make their arguments more persuasive. Mastering the nuances of words, understanding their precise meanings and differences, was a key tool for achieving success in public life. Think about Aristophanes' portrayal of Socrates in the clouds, teaching Strepsiades about grammatical gender. It echoes Protagoras' distinctions, showing how this knowledge could be applied. But there's more to it, especially with Prodicus. Many of his distinctions seem to revolve around ethical concepts or moral psychology. This has led some scholars to contrast him with figures like Callicles or Thrasymachus, seeing him as a bulwark against relativism or immorality. Now, whether we can label all sophists as relativists or immoralists is debatable, but Prodicus's work strongly suggests that these linguistic exercises weren't just about erudition. They were tools for practical training and, crucially, for prompting students to reflect critically on the values of their own society. This drive for correctness extends beyond simple grammar into the realm of poetry. Remember Protagoras' work titled Orthoepeia, The Correctness of Language? Plato mentions it in the Phaedrus, though sadly, we don't know what was inside. But Plato does give us a glimpse in the dialogue named after Protagoras himself. There, Protagoras states that a crucial part of education is understanding what poets say correctly, orthos versus what they don't. To illustrate this, he reads a poem by Simonides, not just to appreciate it, but specifically to highlight its inconsistencies and contradictions regarding virtue and the good. He uses a methodical approach, literal interpretation, unfolding in stages of understanding, analyzing, and giving account. This linguistic scrutiny, like his earlier critiques of Homer's word choices, serves as a tool to examine poetic language. Is it being used correctly? Does it accurately reflect reality or ethical principles? It's a form of literary criticism, but one deeply embedded in the pursuit of orthotes. Now, studying poetry wasn't exactly new territory. As Xenophanes famously put it, everyone learned from Homer from the beginning. Poetry was the standard bearer of Greek culture, the repository of moral values, history, and politics. Kids were expected to memorize epic poems and absorb their lessons. So, Protagoras engaging with poetry seems like a natural extension. But here's the twist. For Protagoras, the wisdom of the poets isn't automatically accepted. Literary criticism becomes a vital intellectual exercise. It allows students to engage with traditional values, not just passively receive them, but actively assess them, deciding whether to approve or reject them. Think about the skills being developed here: careful analysis, critical evaluation, discussing right and wrong, sharpening one's own arguments, challenging others' views. In a competitive city-state like Athens, these weren't just academic skills, they were essential life skills. And for Protagoras himself, tackling the revered poets like Homer or Simonides, even daring to critique them, was a brilliant move for self-promotion. He positions himself as the new authority, the educator equipped to navigate the complexities of the modern polis, contrasting himself with the potentially outdated traditions of the past. This leads us directly to Protagoras' most famous, and perhaps most misunderstood, statement: man is the measure of all things. Now, this wasn't just a random philosophical flourish. It was a direct challenge to the poet's traditional claim to authority. For centuries, poets had positioned themselves as the true educators, the keepers of the flame of genuine Greek tradition. Figures like Solon and Theognis spoke of poets having the measure, metron, of wisdom granted by the muses. This measure meant they could speak truth, distinguish it from falsehood, and thus safeguard the order of reality. They were the custodians of the community's values. But Protagoras throws a wrench in the works. He argues that truth isn't guaranteed by divine inspiration or poetic genius anymore. Instead, humans are the measure, each person according to their own perspective. Truth becomes relative, subjective. This is a massive blow to the poet's privileged position. And notice the strategy here. Protagoras starts by seemingly engaging with tradition, claiming lineage back to Homer and Hesiod, only to ultimately subvert it and stake his claim as the dominant voice in the cultural landscape. It's a classic sophistic maneuver of appropriation. Protagoras wasn't the only sophist wrestling with poetry and tradition. Let's briefly touch on Critias and Hippias. Critias, interestingly, seems to have leaned heavily into antiquarian pursuits, collecting and cataloging quotes from the great poets like Homer and Hesiod. He even presented himself as a rhapsode, a traditional Yin-Yo Shirin. However, his overall ideology appears to be somewhat different from the mainstream sophists, perhaps representing a reaction against the new rhetorical education, advocating instead a return to the perceived purity of traditional poetry. Hippias, on the other hand, was known for his detailed studies of syllables, rhythms, and Homer. He too collected quotes from past masters, creating vast libraries of sayings. The exact use of these collections is debated. Maybe they were just handy quotes for speeches, or perhaps they represented a more detached, historical view of tradition, seeing it as a resource pool rather than an unquestionable depository of truth. Like Critias, Hippias also presented himself as a rhapsode. Again, this adoption of traditional roles seems less like eccentricity and more like another attempt by the Sophists to appropriate and redefine established authorities. Now, let's turn our attention to Gorgias, who deserves special attention for the sheer breadth and, dare I say, audacity of his explorations into logos. While Protagoras seems focused on the rational, analyzable side of language, Gorgias dives into its psychagogic and creative powers too, without neglecting reason. His central obsession remains logos, the power of speech, and establishing his credentials as the ultimate master of it. But Gorgias presents a puzzle. How do we reconcile texts like his on not being, which ends with a rather bleak acknowledgement of language's failure to represent reality, with the encomium of Helen, where he attributes almost divine omnipotence to words? At first glance, they seem utterly incompatible. Yet the text argues maybe they aren't exploring the same facets of language. Perhaps the conclusion of On Not Being sets the stage for the alternative vision presented in Helen. Let's look closer at On Not Being. Gorgias lays out three theses. Nothing is. If it is unknowable, and if it both is and is knowable, it cannot be indicated to other people. Scholars have spent ages debating the first one, nihilism. But maybe the third thesis is even more telling, especially since Gorgias doesn't offer an alternative for it. The argument seems to build towards the conclusion that there's a fundamental gap between things and words. Just as sight can't perceive sound, logos can only speak words, not things themselves. Even if we grant that reality exists, and we somehow know it, we can't communicate that knowledge perfectly. Logos is always, in a sense, foreign to reality. It's like trying to translate a complex thought into a foreign language. You lose something essential in the process. This isn't just a minor point about semantics. It's a profound challenge as to the idea that language can ever provide a perfect, objective description of the world. Then we jump to the encomium of Helen. Here Gorgias is defending Helen of Troy, a famously controversial figure. Using the mythological backdrop, he explores why Paris might have convinced Helen to leave Sparta. This allows him to launch into a famous digression on the power of logos. He declares, speech is a great potentate that by means of an extremely tiny and entirely invisible body performs the most divine deeds. For it is able to stop fear, to remove grief, to instill joy, and to increase pity. Talk about hyperbole, words as divine magic. This celebration of logos' power seems to fly in the face of the conclusion from On Not Being, where language was portrayed as fundamentally limited. So, what gives? Perhaps the key lies in understanding that Gorgias isn't necessarily contradicting himself, but exploring different facets of language. In On Not Being, he's attacking the notion that language's job is to provide an objective, faithful mirror of reality. He argues reality is slippery, resistant to perfect capture. What we get instead is a world of appearances and opinions. Human language, therefore, is always subjective, reflecting a particular viewpoint, not absolute truth. But then in the Helen, he shifts focus. He highlights the autonomy of logos. Language isn't just a failed reflection, it's its own master. Its power doesn't come from mirroring reality accurately, but from creating emotions, shaping opinions, and imposing a kind of order onto our chaotic experiences. It's a provisional order, yes, but one that guides action. So, paradoxically, by emphasizing the limits of language's ability to represent reality, Gorgias ends up celebrating its incredible creative power to shape our world and ourselves. It's a fascinating tension. This emphasis on the creative, perhaps even deceptive, power of logos finds another echo in a testimony about tragedy. Plutarch quotes Gorgias describing tragedy as a deception, in which the one who deceives is more just than the one who does not deceive, and the one who is deceived is more intelligent than the one who is not deceived. Hold on, deception? Isn't that bad? Well, in Parmenides, or the poets, describing something as deceptive often meant it was still part of the world of appearances, not the true reality. But Gorgias operates in a different framework. With no stable, true divine reality left, only changing phenomena and uncertain opinions, deception becomes part of the human condition. Since logos itself is inherently limited in representing reality, it's bound to be, in a sense, deceptive. And the aim of tragedy, according to Gorgias, is this deception, to charm the soul, evoke emotions like pleasure, joy, or pain. This emotional response isn't just manipulation, it's a way to know oneself better and forge a connection with reality, which Gorgias insists is always other to us. So, paradoxically, being willing to deceive through powerful language is more just, and being susceptible to this deception is more intelligent, because it helps us navigate our existence. Just like Protagoras, Gorgias employs a clever strategy of appropriating traditional poetic lore. He famously declares in the Helen that poetry is nothing but a speech that possesses meter. See the pivot? What truly matters is logos, the speech and the skill to use it effectively. Meter is just a decorative flourish. This allows him to elevate rhetoric, the art of logos, above poetry. When he writes the Helen, the real subject isn't Helen herself, it's logos. He's challenging the poet who misrepresents her, implicitly positioning himself as the master of language. By framing poetry in terms of logos, he integrates the traditional poetic wisdom into his broader sophistic teaching. It's another example of taking the old guard's tools and declaring them subordinate to the new master, the rhetorician. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. We've seen how the Sophists engaged with poetry. Now, let's look at rhetoric proper, which emerged as a distinct field of knowledge later in the 5th century and into the 4th. There's a big debate among scholars about who really invented rhetoric, figures like Tisias and Corax in Sicily, then brought to Athens by Gorgias. Or did it develop later? Regardless of who gets the credit, the Sophists were definitely central players. They weren't just users of rhetoric, they brought forward crucial questions about different types of speeches, genres like deliberative, epidictic, judicial, and stylistic choices. And contrary to Plato's often negative portrayal of Sophists relying solely on deception, many early rhetorical texts show sophisticated, rigorous argumentation. Thinkers like Gorgias and Antiphon employed a whole toolkit. Arguments from probability, eikos, antinomy, induction, reductio ad absurdum, and Gorgias's favorite, apagogia, examining all possibilities. They understood that appealing to reason was just as important as appealing to emotion, especially when dealing with complex issues where the truth wasn't obvious. This brings us back to the importance of correctness, orthotes, in practical reasoning. Consider this anecdote. Pericles, after accidentally killing someone during a pentathlon competition, spends a whole day consulting Protagoras. They're trying to figure out, according to the most correct reasoning, kataton orthotaton logon. Who's responsible, the javelin, the thrower, the umpires? The facts are clear, someone died. But responsibility, guilt, judgment, these are murky waters. Different perspectives emerge. The doctor sees the javelin as the cause. The judge blames the thrower. The organizer might fault the judge. This ambiguity is precisely where the sophist thrives. Correctness becomes the lens through which to evaluate these competing viewpoints. Now, did Protagoras actually give a verdict? The story doesn't say, and maybe it doesn't matter. This aligns with his famous claim that concerning every question, one can argue equally well in one direction or the other. The point isn't necessarily finding the single objectively true answer, but finding the most persuasive argument for the situation at hand, the one that best fits the facts and resonates logically. It's about gaining the upper hand in the specific context. So, does this mean the Sophists were just cynical teachers selling tricks for winning arguments? That's too simplistic. Yes, practical success was part of it, but their logoi, their speeches and arguments were far more than mere tools for victory. They were sophisticated instruments designed to probe complex, ambiguous situations. Think about the encomium of Helen again. Sure, Gorgias aims to persuade the audience of Helen's innocence, but he goes way beyond that. By listing all possible reasons for her actions, gods, force, words, desire, and systematically dismantling them, he's not just building a defense. He's investigating the nature of persuasion, human physiology, emotional dynamics, and raising profound questions about responsibility. It's a brilliant display of intellectual prowess, intended to entertain, showcase skill, and provoke deeper reflection on the power of language and the human condition. They weren't building a closed system. They were opening up crucial problems, bringing tensions in thought into sharp relief. In conclusion, the Sophists' intense focus on logos was undeniably central to their intellectual world. They didn't just use language, they analyzed it, critiqued it, and explored its vast potential. They kicked off the serious study of language in its own right, developed critical methods for examining grammar, poetry, and rhetoric, and consistently highlighted the immense power and inherent complexity of language. Whether they were using logos purely for practical persuasion or engaging in deeper reflections on values and reality, their work forced everyone to confront the centrality of language in shaping our understanding of the world and ourselves. Their legacy lies precisely in raising these crucial questions, tensions that continue to challenge and fascinate us today.